joined by Rick Grenell, Senior Advisor for National Security and Foreign Policy. But before we get to him, let's hear from our president, Joe Biden, and we'll get Rick's thoughts after that. So let's hear from him.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
So there you go, a sort of remarkable statement yesterday coming out of President Biden after his meeting with the new German chancellor, and he declared we'll bring an end to the Nord Stream pipeline 2 if Russia invades Ukraine. I just want to get your feedback on that, Rick. Your thoughts. Do you think the Russians believe him? And also just your thoughts on that kind of statement in general being made. And as always, when a pushback is made, how are you going to do this? The answer is what seemingly is always right now, which is trust us, we'll just do it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's remember that Putin has Google. He can see the history of what this administration and what the Obama-Biden administration did. This is another red line, Jordan. This is another red line, like we're going to do something very strong if you invade and take Crimea. Or there's a red line in Syria if Assad uses chemical weapons on his people. I mean, look, the reality is that the Obama-Biden Democratic machine, which I would argue the current crop of Biden appointees are really Obama 3, that whole team has a long history of making threats and never following through on those threats. So I don't believe that Putin believes what Joe Biden is saying. I don't believe that the Europeans believe what Joe Biden is saying. I don't even think Democrats in Congress believe Joe Biden.
It does seem that we present a lot of these situations, like you said, that Putin has Google, and almost as if the Russians or any of China, everyone, like they don't have access to what we're saying publicly. It's a really weird thing, almost like we're living in the 40s, where it's like, we'll talk about what's happening here with the old newsreels, but they're not going to ever see that because how is this still our communications where you're almost giving away so much information that it becomes the threat, like you said, almost dissolves. And the pipeline specifically has been such a weird situation where almost the Biden administration has switched places on the way they viewed it. You said before you weren't a fan of it, then they put it in there, and now it's the thing they may pull out. We may pull out the pipeline. Since Biden has took office, you've been against the pipeline. But what do you think has changed now from the Biden point of view?
Look, I think Washington, D.C., led by Joe Biden of 40 years, is trapped into this idea that we just say the same things, which is like, oh, if you invade, then we're really going to get serious. And it's a situation where Washington is stuck into only military options. I'm really disgusted to see the State Department pushed aside. We need a better State Department. We need diplomats with muscle. We need people who are creative, who can sit across the table and use all of the tools of the U.S. government instead of just sending in U.S. troops. Donald Trump taught us that we have a whole bunch of other tools to use rather than just the drumbeats of war. And I'm concerned that Joe Biden has not understood that. He hasn't learned that lesson from the Iraq and Afghanistan war days. I mean, he has shoved the State Department aside. We could solve this quickly by putting sanctions on Nord Stream 2, but we don't. And what we're saying instead is, if you start a war, Russia, then we'll have to go to that really big diplomatic stick, which is getting rid of your pipeline. Why not do it now? We see what Putin is doing and trying to disintegrate the NATO forces and NATO unity, and he's doing a good job.
And Rick, this kind of goes to a more global issue, which is that the Democrats and liberals have kind of painted conservatives as sort of warmongers over the last 20 years, when really we saw what happened under President Trump. There were no major wars at all, except for we took out ISIS. Positive things happened. But right before that, we were dealing with chaos in the Obama administration. And now we're back to dealing with this chaos. we have to be able to change the narrative because it currently does not make any sense. Sure, during maybe the early Bush years, you could say that, but we were also under attack in 9/11. The world went upside down. But that's not the case anymore. But somehow that gets to still be a point of view that they get to push when clearly the warmongering that's happening is not coming from the conservatives.
Yeah, and I would argue that the warmongering and the lack of creativity when it comes to crisis and problem solving is really a product of Washington, D.C. If you've been in Washington, D.C. a long time, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you immediately go just to the idea of a war and using the Pentagon and boots on the ground. I mean, we've asked our soldiers to actually do what diplomats are supposed to be doing, winning hearts and minds and trying to, negotiate when you're trying to avoid a war. So you negotiate in peace, or at least before a war starts. And so I think that what the solution is that we send outsiders to Washington. Again, this is not Republican versus Democrat. This is Washington, D.C. versus the rest of America.
Yeah, and I'm 100% in favor of that. As someone who's spent, like my brother is there, Jordan is there in Washington, D.C. right now. I don't envy him. I've spent plenty of time in Washington. Not my favorite place in the world, not because it's not beautiful, not because people are, but it's it's just the worst of the worst sometimes, and you can feel it and you know it's true. And I'm sorry, people, I'm not trying to offend people who are listening in Washington, D.C. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the infrastructure and how things work, and it's just a seedy, place to be. And it can give you really, dark feelings when you're there because of how rough it can get. But there are important reasons why we're there, obviously. There's important reasons why we're expanding. Like Rick brought up changing the hearts and minds of people. That is something that in 2022, that's part of my plan here at the organization, the ACLJ, is to take things beyond the courtroom. The courtroom is great and we have to be there. And Rick, we have to be there. But there are ways that we can reach people like never before. And we need to start showcasing our message in very different ways. And we are expanding and growing what that means. And we'll be able to share more with you, the audience, sooner than later, because there are some big developments happening in how we're going to impact Washington, D.C., but also how we're going to try to impact not just our country, but around the world. And Rick, there is something that happened. Obviously, there's been some change in Germany. There's a new ambassador in Germany. Or there's a new chancellor in Germany. You would know as the former ambassador to Germany. This is just my general thoughts. I'm just curious, what's your general take on this new ambassador, this new chancellor, getting those two confused, this new chancellor and the press conference that happened with Joe Biden?
Well, Logan, if we had to pick a socialist, if we were forced to pick a socialist, we would pick Olaf Scholz. He's the best of the socialists in Germany. And so I would say that he's a straight shooter. I know him. He cares about budget issues. He was previously the finance minister. So he's going to look at spending and making sure that there's a Germany first economic model. That's his kind of focus. So I think we've got to watch the Germans as they continue to peel away from the EU. They want a foreign policy that's more like Switzerland, where they're friends with everybody and they can sell cars to everybody. They don't share the same threat assessment that we do. For instance, they don't really think of Iran as a threat. It took a lot of work to get them to understand that they had to outlaw Hezbollah. And I think that what we've seen over the last decade is a very comfortable Germany, where they have a budget surplus and they're trying to be friends with everyone, and they have moved away from the Western alliance. And I really believe that, and I know it's a strong statement, but my experience in Germany is that they have moved away from the transatlantic alliance, from a Western-facing transatlantic alliance. They are not a very good EU member. They don't listen to the rest of the EU. They think about Germany first. Remember, they're not paying their NATO obligations of 2% of their GDP, and they're the largest economy in all of Europe. And at the same time, they have 50,000 American troops protecting them. I've been in a meeting where President Trump looked at Chancellor Merkel and said, you know what? I don't blame you. I don't blame you for not paying your NATO obligations, not paying all that money, because why would you if the United States is going to continue to protect you? It's a smart move. but he also said, you can't blame me for trying to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think that kind of analysis, I've said this to you, Rick, I've said this to our audience over and over again. You're not going to get that anywhere else. If you want to know why these things are important, I think it's very easy for us to kind of shut off the rest of the world and not understand why something like a new chancellor in Germany matters. Well, you just found out why it did from a person who's a former ambassador in Germany, United States. Where else are you going to get that except for on this broadcast and this kind of analysis? So now you can take that information and share it with your friends. That's something that is invaluable. Thank you, Rick, for your time.